Alan Kurschner presents us with a work that seeks to argue against the pre-tribulational rapture, while at the same time holding to a 7-year future tribulation that is the 70th week of Daniel, which will then be followed by the millennial reign of Christ on earth. Now, as someone who holds to the pre-tribulational rapture, this is kind of a tough review because the natural thing to do is simply argue against his arguments and have that be the review. But that wouldn't really be a book review. That would just be an argument on the timing of the rapture. So I'm going to follow C.S. Lewis's advice on criticism here, and first thank Kurschner for his diligent effort in writing this book, let you know its strengths and its weaknesses, and Lord willing, turn this into a review and not an argument. So, how did Alan do at critiquing the pre-trib rapture position? Let's cover it. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will challenge you in your faith, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with the most current reviews. And also, if you're a regular, please like this video, share it with other people to help them know about the work of Alan Kurschner. I gotta say, I have more positive to say about this book than I expected going into it. First, this book is written in a very ironic tone. I didn't feel attacked, belittled, or shamed for holding my view, which often happens if you're a pre-tribulational dispensationalist. I always felt like his arguments were being built upon the content of Scripture, the actual words of dispensationalists, and not straw men or ad hominem attacks. A lot of authors who write books on topics that they disagree with, so books where you're attacking a view, a lot of authors who write those books could learn from how Alan treats pre-tribulational rapture proponents in this book. Second, I appreciate that Kurschner was consistently building his argument from the pages of Scripture and not a philosophical construct that he was placing upon the text. His interpretation methods were good, and he kept the book focused on the Bible throughout. I do think that overall in the Scripture, I would find massive agreement with the author, thanks to the way that he approached the Bible and interpretation. I came away reading this book actually thinking, man, if Alan Kurschner and I couldn't be friends, if the timing of the rapture forced us to separate, that would be a shame because we would agree on so many other things. And so I applaud him for his overall approach to the Bible. I also thought there were a few pre-trib arguments that he exposed as being not biblically based or using some circular reasoning. And frankly, that's why you should read books such as this, books by authors with whom you disagree. Because what they allow you to do is to see the shortcomings of your own perspective and your, at times, poor arguments for your view. For instance, the requirement that God cannot deal with Israel and the church at the same time. And that's why the rapture must come before the tribulation. That isn't a biblically based argument. God never states anywhere in the Scripture that he will only work with Israel and then only work with the church and can't work with the two of them at the same time, and there can be no overlap with the dispensations. I even think Kurschner made a good point when he mentioned the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That was directed at Israel, and that was well after the start and the founding of the church. And his point on how the imminence of the rapture is often supported by circular reasoning, that was also correct. So there is some worthwhile stuff in this book, more than I expected, and I am glad to have read his perspective on the rapture of the church and how it related to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now here's the negative. First, the book should have begun with a clear statement, a clear chapter on Kurschner's view supporting the pre-wrath rapture. I think if he was clear on his own view up front, it would have actually strengthened his arguments throughout the book, because then the reader would know the direction that he is drawing them in toward. Second, while most of his points were well argued, a lot of them, even that stuck home, didn't actually disprove the pre-trib rapture. They simply pointed that those who support the pre-trib rapture have several poor arguments to support their view. For instance, he spent a lot of time in this book on how God works with Israel and the church simultaneously. And that could be true. And if it is true, though, it doesn't in any way disprove the pre-trib rapture. If anything, it would just take away a rather weak argument for it that's not built on any specific passage in Scripture. And then here's my big struggle with this book, and frankly, this might separate me from some other dispensationalists, but I actually agree with him that the rapture belongs to the second coming, that the rapture is part of the day of the Lord. And I think this is why the rapture was overlooked and missed by so many people throughout church history. And one problem that we have in our view of the day of the Lord is that the day of the Lord should not be seen as a singular 24-hour day, that day when Jesus Christ actually returns and steps on the Mount of Olives. But the day of the Lord at Christ's second coming is a lot like the Exodus from Egypt. And so my question would be, how long was the Exodus from Egypt? Was it a single day? No. I would argue the Exodus began when Moses saw that burning bush out in the wilderness. And then the Exodus ended either when Israel arrived at Mount Sinai or even later when Israel crossed the Jordan River and entered Israel 40 years later. So a singular event in the Bible can last years. And the day of the Lord is at minimum 7 years. It might be longer if there's a gap between the rapture and the first seal judgment. So Kurschner in his book writes, the Perugia presupposition disconnects the rapture and resurrection from the second coming. Well, I don't do that in my support of the pre-trib rapture. There is a 7-year separation between the rapture and the second coming of Jesus Christ, but it's all one event. It is the day of the Lord the entire time. And so much of this book was about how the rapture is part of the second coming. And I agree with that. So if you, like me, see the day of the Lord covering all of the events of the tribulation, and I struggle to see why that isn't a common view among dispensationalists. Maybe I am weird to believe that the revelation of Jesus Christ started with the opening of the seals that began with the seal judgments. I mean, how is a book on the revelation of Jesus Christ and all of the events that lead up to the revelation of Jesus Christ not part of his second coming? And I think that is where I differ with Kurschner. I see the day of the Lord starting with the rapture of the saints to then remove them from the wrath of the Lamb, which begins with the seal judgments. And so if he wanted to convince me of a pre-wrath rapture, what he should have been focusing his time on is that the seal judgments are not part of the wrath of the Lamb, and I would have had my reasons why I would disagree with that view. And my final critique on the book is that I would have spent more time covering the pre-wrath rapture view. Because even after reading in the appendix where he overviewed his position, I am honestly just still confused as to what the pre-wrath rapture view is in relation to what he calls the Antichrist wrath, God's wrath, the trumpet and bowl judgments. Because it appears to me that if someone holds to the pre-wrath view, you really need to jumble up the order of the events in Revelation as well as other passages to make the pre-wrath view work. And doing that makes me not overly understand the way he presented the pre-wrath view. And I want to say this also is that I'm not saying this to boast in myself, but obviously if you watch this channel, I read a lot of books. I also receive plenty of feedback from other authors whose books I have reviewed. And the most common feedback I receive from authors whose books I've reviewed, whether I agree with the author or not agree with the author, the most common feedback I receive is that I really connected with the viewpoint of the author. I got the goal of the author and what they were trying to put forward in that book. So something I never expected, but it seems like a gift or talent that I might possess, is that I'm good at understanding the viewpoint and the purpose of a writer. And if I can't understand the view of the pre-wrath rapture presented in this book, I think it needs a little bit better presentation in this book, and I especially think it needs to move from an appendix at the end to the very first chapter. I believe the author's goal is not just simply to expose what he sees as the flaws of the pre-trib rapture view, but his goal is to move the reader into a pre-wrath view for the rapture, and that's not going to happen if he doesn't present his own view clearly enough. So in the end, this book had many strengths, such as the book's tone, its engagement with scripture, and exposing some weak pre-trib arguments, but then it had weaknesses as well, which were depending too much on disconnecting the rapture from the second coming, when I believe they are intimately linked, even if that link lasts 7 years. And we need to remember that in God's timing and the way the Bible presents history, 7 years is basically the blink of an eye. And then the author should have taken more time to present his own pre-wrath view at the beginning of the book in a way that is understandable for the reader, who I'm assuming he wants to be coming from the pre-trib rapture perspective. In the end, I believe pre-trib proponents would do well to read this book, to challenge themselves to read a book that confronts their view of the rapture. But in the end, I don't think this book will convince many people to change from a pre-trib rapture view to a pre-wrath rapture view.